Hi, I'm James, and welcome to another edition of Review Roulette. Final Fantasy II is, in my opinion, a severely underrated game. Yes, there are common complaints, and they aren't without merit, but when you look at all that Final Fantasy II brought to the table, how many mainstay staples it introduced to the franchise, and its bold attempts at new mechanics, it introduced so much to the world of RPGs that it shouldn't be shrugged aside as merely the lesser-known brother of the greats, 4, 6, 7, whatnot. Because without 2, so much of what makes Final Fantasy great wouldn't be there. Sure, to Americans it seems all fine and good that we had our Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy II, aka 4, without thinking about all the games that came before what we believe to be the second game in the series. Final Fantasy IV is a masterpiece. It is a wonderful game that raised the bar for what a JRPG could be, especially with regard to its characters and story. But we need to remember that we didn't just jump from 1 to 4 without getting a great deal from 2 and 3. So I want to talk today about why Final Fantasy II is so important to the franchise, and why I believe it should be spoken of more highly and more often in RPG circles. Before I begin, I want to clarify a couple things about this review. Number 1, this will not be a blow-by-blow of the story. It is a Final Fantasy game after all, and I don't want to be here all day. Number 2, having only played the PSP version of the game, I'm not going to be doing a comparison of the various ports among various consoles. I'm going to be talking about the PSP version with the understanding that all of the truly novel traits have been there since the original Famicom game. For example, as much as I love the endgame dungeon of Fallen Comrades, I understand that that was an addition introduced to the GBA version, so my praise of that is separate from my praise of Final Fantasy II as a whole and its legacy among RPGs. To begin, let's take a look at the story elements and character interactions. This was the first game in the franchise to have true characters and a compelling story and a backstory for the characters. Yes, Final Fantasy I had the Wandering Heroes of Light, but we knew nothing about them, who they were, where they were from. Final Fantasy II, on the other hand, introduced the concept of having pre-named characters whom the player could choose to rename, with a clear story that the player would jump into and become a part of. To make this work, the writers fell back on a very common story device. The age-old tale of the evil empire who wants to take over the world, and the band of rebels who want to stop them at all cost. Yes, it's been done to death. Star Wars instantly comes to mind. But it's done all the time because it works, so no shame there. To further enhance the story and interactions with non-playable characters from various towns, Final Fantasy II introduced a keyword system, where certain words spoken by NPCs could be recorded or memorized. That way, when talking with other NPCs, the player could mention those keywords to see which villagers could give them more info regarding specific topics. This was necessary to advance various plot points in the story by encouraging certain characters to talk with you based on what you know about them or your knowledge of the rebel group. Pretty advanced for a console RPG from the 80s. The second thing I want to talk about is the way the game manages the party. In all of the main Final Fantasy games, you have a party usually made of 3 or 4 main playable characters. While Final Fantasy I and II both used the traditional 4-party team, what made Final Fantasy II so interesting is that at the beginning of the story, one of the team members disappears. Their slot is taken by one of 5 allies who join the party at various points along their quest, each with their own role to play in the story, and each with their own unique fighting style, including the first ever Final Fantasy Dragoon. 3 of these characters, along with a few NPCs, give their lives for their friends in the rebellion, making this the first time in the franchise that party members are killed off. Cough. Aerith. Cough. Oh, excuse me, I seem to have something caught in my throat. That's better. Other party-based additions include the introduction of the back row for protecting weaker characters, the ability to switch weapons and armor mid-battle, and the ability to customize your characters, at least in the same sense of Final Fantasy VII and VIII, where rather than preset fighters, monks, or mages, you could choose which of your characters to make the dedicated healer and which ones to focus on offensive fighting. This is probably the most divisive and conflicting addition to the franchise. Characters can be trained in proficiency in various weapon types, from swords and daggers and axes to lances and bows and staves. Even shields have their own proficiency level. Well, I guess not everyone can effectively use a shield. While the original Final Fantasy had proficiency levels of sorts for white and black magic, Final Fantasy II took it a step further, with each individual spell having its own proficiency level that affected its damage or its effectiveness. This customization not only affected the types of weapons and spells used, but also the character's basic stats. HP, MP, strength, dexterity, and other stats all increased not through a random number generator or experience point-based system, but through a real-time, action-based system. As characters attack, defend, or take damage, invisible status bars fill, and the level of each stat increases independently. Essentially, any action taken in battle short of using items or running away can affect some characters' stats. A lot of people complain about this being a broken system because you can't raise your defense or HP without taking damage. But doesn't that kind of make sense? Any sort of physical activity strengthens the body parts used, just as playing stringed instruments builds calluses on the fingers. Now, people have pointed out that this is broken because you can just initiate a random battle and have your characters attack and heal each other to raise those stats. And while this is true, it's not exactly a problem unique to Final Fantasy II. Grinding has been as much a part of Final Fantasy as any other RPG. Final Fantasy VIII had a similarly broken mechanic with the junction system and drawing magic from enemies. Frankly, I don't think these issues are that serious because a game is only as broken as you make it. I never felt required to grind battles to advance in the game, even near the end of the game. And part of that's because the encounter rate always seemed so much higher in Final Fantasy II than other games. Well, I suppose raising enemy encounter rates is one way to solve the grinding problem. As for the action-based or skill-based system, while it had its ups and downs, it didn't end with Final Fantasy II. Other games of various franchises would revisit and experiment with this system, such as Chrono Cross, Grandia, and the later games of the Elder Scrolls series. However, most of these games would combine the skill-based leveling system of weapons and armor with a more traditional experience point system for character stats. Third, let's look at transportation. Like its predecessor, Final Fantasy II makes use of ships, canoes, and the awesome airship, including a special airship taxi service that helped the characters get to certain towns faster early in the game, which, by the way, was run by the first ever iteration of Cid, a character who would return for major or minor roles in almost every Final Fantasy game to follow. Final Fantasy II also introduced two new modes of travel: the Snowcraft, for getting you through the mountain areas, and the beloved mascot of Final Fantasy, the Chocobo. That's right, Final Fantasy II gave us those cute little birds that would not only become the most fun method of travel, but also give us some of the best mini-games in future Final Fantasy installments. Finally, as much as I love the Final Fantasy franchise for its characters and stories and gameplay mechanics, the one thing, above all else, that really draws me to these games is the music. From victory jingles to overworld and character themes, Final Fantasy is loaded with beautiful, emotional, invigorating, and catchy music. And Final Fantasy II is no exception. Along with the Chocobo, we were introduced to the quirky Chocobo theme. We have the tense theme of the final dungeon Pandemonium. We have the beautiful ending theme. And the daunting overworld theme. And my personal favorite, the Rebel theme. I love this piece because of how well it captures both the bold, adventuring side of the rebels, but also the sadness, the dread of the small band of fighters daring to oppose the Empire, fighting against overwhelming odds. From its moving story of tragic characters to its beautiful music, its somewhat more realistic method of stat development, and its enhancements to the traveling combat system that would remain key to the series for years to come, Final Fantasy II is not only an important entry in the franchise, but a great RPG in its own right. Whether or not you like the method for leveling up weapons and stats, hopefully you agree that it's at least an innovative and interesting new way to develop characters. The developers of the Final Fantasy games have always been open to experimentation and new ideas, for better or worse, and personally, I think Final Fantasy II has more hits than misses. I think it's a real shame that just because of its older style and its Japanese-only original release, Furion, Master of All Weapons, and his band of rebels aren't as well known as, say, Cloud, or Squall, or Lightning, or Titus. Whatever, he was a stupid character anyway. Thank you for watching.